When choosing a steak, there's typically a trade-off between two things: beefy flavor and tenderness. Today, we do a deep dive into the true king of both.
The flat iron steak, which is not only the best steak, but it's actually one of the cheaper ones too. So, let's break it down.
For example, ribeye is super beefy, but not the most tender, and then we have the ever-famous Filet Mignon, which is the most tender of all steaks, but actually not super flavorful. Now, some would say the New York strip is a nice blend of the two, but my friends, the flat iron is the unicorn of all steaks. Scientifically, it's the second most tender steak behind the filet, and guess what? It's also loaded with a beefy flavor that rivals the ribeye because it comes from the chuck or shoulder of the animal. I mean, just look at that intermuscular fat.
So now you may be asking, why have I never heard of flat iron? Why can't I find this at my grocery store? Or how do I get this on my dinner plate? Link below for 15% off your first order if you want to check it out. But I'm actually going to have James, a professional butcher, tell us all about this steak, including why this is the only steak that still tastes good when cooked well done. But more importantly, he's going to show us exactly how this steak is cut, because it's one of the most difficult steaks for a butcher to seam out. And up until a couple of decades ago, the flat iron steak didn't even exist. All right, everybody, so I've got James with me from Porter Road, and we're actually gonna cover specifically the flat iron steak, which is a steak I didn't even know about until about 2 years ago, and it's one of my personal favorites. And he's also gonna tell you why this is a steak that the only steak that you actually can't really overcook.
Yeah, so the flat iron is one of those newer cuts. As the beef started to get bigger, we were able to harvest this out with our seam butchery. This particular muscle comes from the chuck, that shoulder piece, lives right on top of that scapula, that paddle bone. We peel it back. It's hard working, but tender. Because of the marbling intermuscular fat that's in it, and because of the thin, short muscle fibers, it creates a tender, delicious piece of meat. Most other cuts in the entire animal cooked past 145 degrees start becoming dry and really, really tough. This one in particular, you can cook to that 165 degree. It'll be well done, but it'll still be tender and have a little bit of juiciness.
Yep.
And I say a little bit of juiciness because of the intermuscular fat.
Yeah.
You've, at that point, at 165 degrees, expelled all the moisture out of that product. And the only reason we should ever cook any kind of meat to that temperature is because we're going all the way up to that 195 to 205 degree.
Hit the melting, collagen melting zone, yeah.
Yep. This particular one, phenomenal, delicious. It is a very difficult, finicky cut to get out. So I'm gonna show you how we separate it out. We'll clean up the outside, and then it's actually two separate pieces of meat that have a piece of silver that goes right down the middle of it and create these two beautiful inch thick cuts that are just phenomenal, wonderful, and extremely flavorful.
All right, let's do it. Let's see you cut this thing.
So again, just like every time you and I get together to butcher, what we're gonna do is kind of have the animal tell us what to do and follow the seams that we're doing. And make sure that we're utilizing the animal to the best of our ability and making sure that we're creating as much value out of the animal as possible. So that way we can in turn reward our farmer for going above and beyond and going the extra mile to make sure that the animals are taken care of and they're fed and raised in the right way.
And you said previously cows were being, harvested at much smaller sizes, so this would have been, not even really worth it. It would have been so small that you couldn't even really get a steak out of it.
Yeah, so pigs have a flat iron.
Yeah.
Lamb has a flat iron.
Yeah.
But again, we've harvested it just for fun.
And
it's a quarter ounce, a quarter pound, not a quarter ounce. But it's extremely small. So it's, is the juice worth the squeeze at that point? And as the animals have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, this particular steak became more and more desirable, and it made more and more sense to actually harvest it out. All four-legged animals, once you can cut up one, you can really cut up anyone. Yeah. But then it depends on how much are we utilizing, how much are we taking out, and what are we doing with it. This whole top half is silver skin, and you can see my knife angling up.
Yep.
So as we're cutting silver skin, we should be able to angle our knife towards it because it's that chewy and tough.
You can't really even slice through it.
So it gives us the ability to end up with a nice clean surface And the reason why we always want to make sure that our tools, our knives, our saws, everything we're using to butcher is nice and sharp is not only because we end up with this beautiful surface, and the more oxygen that it gets exposed to, the faster it's going to rot.
Right.
So with a very sharp knife cut, it's actually going to stay longer.
Right.
Where if we're using, you know, that old knife that you've had in your parents' kitchen for the last, 30 years, it's going to end up creating something that you need to use fast.
Yeah, exposing like kind of rough edges that just obviously air is kind of the enemy of food. What causes things to spoil so fast.
Mm-hmm. So we've cleaned that silver off of the top. And you can see here, see that giant piece of silver? So the silver skin's actually going to come down this way and then taper down that way.
And that's like the chewy piece if we were not to get rid of it this way.
This is the extremely chewy piece, the piece that is the reason why you've seen it not harvested before.
And so what would this have been if we didn't take it out? Would it just have been like in a roast or something like that?
Yeah, so this normally gets left in the chuck roast, in the 7-bone roast. That unfortunately gets lost to the world and then just gets braised down, which is a shame. There's a few veins in here we want to make sure we get out. And then again, what we're doing here is about uniformity, making sure that our steak is cut evenly, we don't have any dangles, and it's clean and beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, you can totally see why it is a lot of extra work just to get this piece.
Just
why you don't really see it in many places.
Yeah, you're not going to get that, teenager butcher at your local grocery store that's going to have the patience or the knife skills to be able to make this cut in particular happen. And then again, there are much better butchers out there in the world. There are people who can take this flat iron in one swipe and be able to do it. I am a decent butcher. There are much betters out there in the world. And the important thing to us at Porter Road is that we get our we end up cutting them, our 4 8-ounce steaks out of it. So what we're doing is cutting it to get those beautiful 2 center cut pieces. And again, you could have left this thing a little more whole. You could have left those tails on it. It would have been just as delicious. It would have been great. It would have been wonderful. But the way we retail it and what we use it for, in particular, is to make sure that it hits our weights for our online store.
And then you're using all that excess stuff for ground meat, things like that anyway.
And as we cut down, like if I had to cut this piece off, that becomes steak tips. Because that's beyond ground beef at that point. But making sure that we're squaring it off, making sure that that silver is going away, making sure that it is a unique, beautiful, amazing cut. And then you end up with these 2 just beautiful, delicious pieces. I mean, look at that marbling inside of there. It's just phenomenal. It's incredible. It's great. And we cut them into 8-ounce portions. And I mean,
that's just it's as beautiful as any steak. Everyone knows their fillets, their ribeyes, and their New York strips, but this is such it's a different cut,
Smell it.
Yeah,
I mean, that dry age.
You can totally smell it. It just cooks up so nicely too. Like I said, I think the first time I had it was a couple years ago, and we had gotten meat from a local farmer friend of my dad's, and I was like, I'd never even heard of this cut before, and now it's one of my favorites. But you can't really find it in most places.
No, it's one of those cuts again that's finicky. It's more of a challenge to get out. Most people don't like dealing with it.
Yep.
To us, it's worth every bit extra of effort. And then you can always utilize scraps in little steak bits.
Now, hopefully that was informative, but if you thought the fun was over, I'm about to painfully overcook some expensive steaks in the name of science.
Specifically, there's 2 tests I wanted to run. So first, I'm going to cook all 3 of these steaks to 130 degrees Fahrenheit to compare them. Then we're going to do the exact same thing with 3 more steaks, except I'm going to cook them to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, or well done.
Okay, so truthfully, hopefully I didn't ruin this experiment. I didn't realize how difficult it would be to time 3 different cuts of steak with varying thicknesses to exactly 130 degrees. Was a little bit stressed there for a moment. My fire alarm was going off for like 10 minutes. But anyway, let's just go in these and we'll see what they look like inside. I think I got these 2 right around 130. This one might be a touch over, but we'll give them a taste anyway. Moment of truth. Okay, yeah, looking pretty good. Yeah, this tenderloin looks pretty solid, about a medium, I would say. I wouldn't say medium rare, I'd say that's more medium. That's fine though. Now for the flat iron. Get that up close. Yeah, again, I would say, no, this one I would say is more medium rare, which is what I was kind of looking for. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm looking for right there. Then lastly, let's get this ribeye. Yeah, so again, I think more, that's about medium rare too. I think I did a fairly decent job actually. So hopefully you guys can see these. We're gonna do the filet first. I'll try to get an up close shot for each of these so you can kind of see the muscle fibers and how they are. But let's give it a taste. I mean, if you've had filet mignon, no surprise there. So freaking tender. Like it just kind of melts away in your mouth. But yeah, not super beefy. So now we're gonna kind of go to the other end of the spectrum and go take off a slice of the ribeye. So hopefully you guys can see up close, just look how much different and bigger these muscle fibers are for the ribeye. So that's the main reason why this isn't as tender as something like that filet mignon. But since it does have all that extra fat in it, it should taste a lot more beefy. For the ribeye, again, it definitely has kind of a better mouthfeel, a little bit more fat in it, which is really nice, but is definitely more chewy than just like the fall apart nature of the filet mignon. But lastly, let's give my favorite, the flat iron, a try. So again, just looking up front of those muscle fibers, definitely much smaller than the ribeye, though not quite as, fine as that filet, but let's give it a taste. That right there is why the flat iron is the king. So it's basically just a much better tasting filet mignon, at least in my opinion. Like the beefiness totally is amped up much closer to a ribeye or something like that. But where this has those bigger muscle fibers, where you get, it's a little bit more chewy or whatever, which is still good. Like all these steaks are amazing, right? But flat iron is just so unique in its taste, and especially coming from them side by side, it really does remind me of like a combination of the filet and the ribeye, which is super cool. So as to be expected, we cooked them to a nice temperature. Now I actually do want to test what these things look like at 160 degrees Fahrenheit or well done. So I'm gonna all do them in the oven and I'll meet you guys back here in just a second. So now the moment you've been waiting for, some overcooked steak. Let's actually cut into these. So as you can see, still a little bit of red actually in there at 160, but much darker. All right, so again, we'll go down the line. We'll hit the filet mignon first. So much grayer, definitely a little bit tougher, but should still be pretty, pretty tender. Definitely a lot, like a significantly amount more chew in this overcooked one. I mean, it still tastes okay, but yeah. I mean, this is why we don't cook steak to this temperature, especially not filet. All right, let's move over to the ribeye. Again, we can see those much bigger muscle fibers. Interested to see what this difference one is in the well done version. Yeah, definitely really dry compared to what we just had earlier. Also, those bigger chunks definitely tighten up more. Just not enjoyable. Again, let's see how it compares. This is really what we're doing. Obviously, you don't want to cook steak to 160 degrees. I mean, you could like this texture, but that's fine. But let's do this last one first. So again, we have the flat iron steak. You can see smaller fibers, not quite as small as the filet, but let's see how it goes. And it's really interesting to do these side-by-side taste tests. So I hope you guys try this if you want. I mean, I would not do this specific test. I would do the one that we did from earlier, the 130, medium rare or whatever temperature you like your steak. Do that test. Don't do this one. Because what I'm probably going to do is just cut these up and use them in like a stir fry or maybe a pasta, or I'll figure something out to use for this. But it is really interesting because the size of the muscle fiber, again, that's a massive thing with the flat iron that makes it unique. But then you do get a lot more juicy. It was significantly more juicy than both the ribeye and the filet, which is, it's just really cool to learn about all these different cuts. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video. Hopefully you learned a little something about just variety of meat cuts and all that. It's super interesting. But that's gonna wrap it up for me in this one. Again, if you guys wanna pick up some flat iron or any of the great steaks, they've got fillets, they've got ribeyes, they've got everything. Porter Road is offering everyone 15% off their first order. Just check the link down below. But that's gonna wrap it up for me in this one. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace, y'all. What do you think now?
That's a compelling argument.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's very good.
You said you liked ribeye most.
I do.
But you have to admit, the texture on this is way better than that.
Yeah.
But it's still beefy.